This is lesson 17.1, and I've got the dirt on the agricultural revolution. Working the land. What important developments led to increased agricultural production, and how did these changes affect peasants? Because peasants tend to work the land. College Board Topic 3.3, Continuities and Changes to Economic Practice and Development. Economic development, especially the development of capitalism, played an important role in Europe's history, often having significant social, political, and cultural effects, and capitalism was a big part of agriculture. The agricultural revolution raised productivity and increased the supply of food and other agricultural products. And the importation and the transplantation of agricultural products from the Americas contributed to an increase in the food supply in Europe. We saw a hint of this when we talked about the Columbian Exchange. This is a picture of a seed drill, and that is going to have a role in our agricultural revolution. Where are we talking about? Well, in particular, England and the Dutch Republic, and then later on, the rest of Europe. Key concepts. Well, of course, you've got the agricultural revolution. Another component of it is the enclosure system and the putting out system, and, of course, population growth. So what was going on before? And what we've got that was going on before was the legacy of the open field system. In the open field system, rural villagers worked in community together. There was no here's Farmer Jones's farm and this is Farmer Johnson's farm. Villagers worked in community in open fields and on common land. There were no hedges, there were no fences. Everybody did the same thing at the same time. They all did the plowing, all did the sowing or the harvesting, etc. And it was a system that was inherited from the Middle Ages. The big problem with this system was soil exhaustion. Nitrogen is necessary to grow many crops, particularly grain, and nitrogen depletion was partially solved by the two-crop rotation system, in which you grow grain in a field one year and then let it go fallow and let it be used as grazing land the second year. Nitrogen depletion was solved somewhat better by the three-crop rotation, and that would be grain, legumes, and then letting it go fallow. So now you're getting the land being used 2 years out of 3 instead of 1 year out of 2. But these techniques had limited effectiveness, and the state and the landlords exploited the peasants through heavy taxes and high rents. Serfdom was the norm in Eastern Europe, as we know, especially in Russia. Serfdom meant that you worked your lord's land instead of your own land for free a certain number of days per week. And serf people and families were regularly bought and sold. Serfdom was gone in Western Europe, but you still had some strong remnants of feudalism, which we will find out in the French Revolution. Peasants could own or even inherit their own land, though, in Western Europe. It was possible. Then 2 things happened. The Columbian Exchange happened, and root crops like potatoes came to Europe from America. Potatoes, peas, beans, turnips, and clover. And these root crops did several things. Number one, they restored nutrients back into the fields with their roots. And now you could use all of your land all of the time. You could grow summer crops, and then you could use it to grow winter crops. And these new foods fed both people and animals. The animal crop productivity cycle also happened, and it involved this process. Now you've got more animals, and that means more fertilizer for the fields. More animals also meant more meat and more dairy products. More animals also meant more plowing and cart pulling power. And all of these factors increased agricultural productivity even further beyond just the new crops that we've talked about. And keep in mind that the whole world was seriously underpowered. So more animals and more power, that is quite significant. The other thing that happened was the scientific revolution, which we will study in our next chapter. Scientists and governments, as well as landowners, all got involved in ramping up agricultural production. Engineers learned more effective ways to drain swamps and marshes to create more farmland. They said, we're going to drain the swamp. And this particular endeavor began in the Dutch Republic, but the English soon learned how to do this from the Dutch, and the increase in food production was very high. Then we have the enclosure system, and this is part and parcel of our agricultural revolution. It's also going to lead to things that are even more dynamic and even more impactful on our lives. There was general agreement among all these various people that effective experimentation with crops could not happen in an open field system where entire communities were working the same land. The whole community had to buy into this experiment or it would not work. Think of it like this. This field that you're trying to find ways to make more productive is kind of like your laboratory. And you can't have people traipsing all over your laboratory. It'll totally ruin your experiment. And so that was the problem they're trying to solve with this enclosure system. There was also general agreement that the improved food production was worth every bit of the upheaval and disruption it would cause to village life if vast tracts of land were enclosed with fences and hedges to keep people away from the experiment, right? So enclosing the land meant that new methods were now free from communal interference. But it also meant that peasants were cut off from many sources of livelihood: farmland for farming, woods for gathering, grazing land for their animals. So here's what the enclosure movement was. This was a movement towards enclosing vast tracts of land with fences and hedges, and it was not automatic. Many peasant communities resisted this for decades. Many landowners also resisted. They had to invest tons of money in all of this fencing and all of this equipment and all of this labor. Enclosure systems and open field community systems often operated side by side right next to each other for many years. But eventually, the enclosure movement won out almost everywhere. So who was actually putting up all these fences and all of these hedges and closing off formerly open fields and common areas? Well, at first it was private landowners. They had more than half of English farmland enclosed by 1700. And then the process was completed by the English government. Parliamentary acts had almost all English farmland enclosed by 1815. Was the enclosure movement a necessary part of increased food production? It was generally believed to be necessary at the time. Other historical research has suggested that open farming communities were still able to introduce the same innovations that were introduced in the enclosure movement. And this means that all of that social upheaval that went along with cutting entire communities off from their land was perhaps not necessary. The social results of the agricultural revolution and its stepchild, the enclosure system: half the farmland in the entire country was now owned by a tiny minority of wealthy landowners. These were capitalists who pursued profits aggressively, and they leased their land to middle-class farmers, and these middle-class farmers would hire landless laborers to help them. And because of all the technological developments, far fewer of these landless workers were necessary. Huge numbers of landless underemployed peasants resulted. And hence you had what we can call the proletarianization of the rural economy. In other words, a rural economy in which there are just a few wealthy capitalists and a lot of just common workers. Those that did work on the land worked long hours all year round, 6 days a week. These peasants who had made their living for generations by working the land with their backs and with their hands now didn't have enough work to do. And these people had to find a new way to supplement their income with some kind of industry other than farm labor. Turns out they did have another option. And that will be the focus of our next lesson. The leadership of the Low Countries and England, the Low Countries like the Dutch Republic and England, they were the leadership countries in the agricultural revolution. And there were several reasons that the Dutch were at the forefront of this revolution. Number one, these countries were densely populated. I mean, even today, the Netherlands is the most densely populated country in Europe, and Belgium is the second most densely populated. They also had exploding urban centers like Amsterdam. And so these countries needed to get the maximum yield out of the available space that they had. They needed to be able to feed their people. They needed to be able to employ their people, and hence the steady draining of swamps and marshes to increase land area. Dense population also means, however, that you have a reliable market for all the food you can grow. There's a lot of people to buy it. So the Low Countries became a kind of a mecca for every agriculturalist who wanted to see for themselves what the Dutch were doing. The English made the most out of what the Dutch had to teach. In fact, they even hired famous Dutch engineer Cornelius Vermuyden to direct large drainage projects in Yorkshire and Cambridgeshire. Jethro Tull, not the band, lived from 1674 to 1741. He was a brilliant innovator. He was an Enlightenment thinker. And he applied scientific methods and empiricism, which we'll learn about with chapter 16, to agriculture. And he pushed for using horses to pull plows rather than oxen, because horses are stronger and they can pull from the shoulders rather than from a yoke on the neck, which gives them a lot more leverage. He also pushed for planting seeds by drilling them into the ground rather than just by scattering them on the ground. And he made improvements to an older idea, the seed drill. He didn't invent it, but he improved it. But many more improvements were still needed. Jethro Tull also pushed for selective breeding of farm animals to get better animals. People had already been doing that with race horses for a long, long time.